weren't part of this church for more than a few weeks before they bought pens for our pews. I think probably the pens that are in front of you were some that they bought. It's the kind of people they are. They see a little need and they rise to fill it. And that's a wonderful testimony. Share your stories with one another. Today would be a great opportunity after we gather over there with a little bit of food just to tell one another how you remember Debi and how special she was. I'm going to ask if you would to grab the blue hymnal in front of you and turn to page 467 and stand with me. Let us sing together a song that is definitely being sung in heaven at least once a day. How great thou art, how great thou art. Stand and let's sing together. The psalmist writes this psalm of comfort. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all of their troubles. And the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. God is with us to comfort us in our times of mourning. Sometimes we think, when we think we have lost too much, when we think we can't go on, that is the very place where we find the hidden strength that Christ brings us. And that is often when something like resurrection takes place. Chris, I'm going to address most of these comments to you, but they clearly are addressed to all of us this afternoon. The Apostle Paul says that Christ is strong in our weakness. And what this means is that when we are at the bottom, when we think we can't go on, when we are lonely, when we are hurting, it is then that we can lean on Jesus Christ and we can lean on his strength. For most of your adult life, Chris, you leaned on Debi. You had each other. I encourage you now to turn and lean on Jesus Christ, and he will sustain you. And in saying that, I'm going to just recount a couple of stories out of the Scripture. I hope that you can find strength in, and that we all can. The first story is the story of Israel. It might be the biggest story of Scripture because it runs throughout most of Scripture. We have all heard Israel's story about how God brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of slavery, with great signs and with the guidance of Moses and with many wonders. But before they left Egypt, before they were set free from slavery, they lived in that land for 430 years. And when they first came to the land of Egypt, life for Israel was good. They had good land and they flourished in that land. And they even had the favor of Pharaoh. But we read in Exodus that a new Pharaoh came and did not remember Joseph. And he took away their freedom and they became slaves. And it is then that they cried out to God. The story of Israel is kind of like your story, Chris. You met and married this wonderful woman, and life was good. It had its ups and downs, to be sure, but you loved each other, and you built a life together for many, many years. And then just a few days ago, it all changed. Debi went to be with Christ, and the happiness you shared was taken. It would be easy to see how you are now a slave to loneliness and hurt and to grief. It might even feel like the chains of despair cannot or never will be broken. But that's only part of the story. If we look at the rest of the story, at the very moment of despair, this is when God rises up magnificently. What did God do when he heard the cries of Israel? He delivered them. These poor slaves who had nothing but loss were delivered from their slavery They were poor, but when they left Egypt, they left with silver and with gold. The psalmist tells us part of that story in Psalm 105. He says, God brought out Israel laden with silver and gold, and from among their tribes no one faltered. Egypt was glad when they left because the dread of Israel had fallen on them. He spread out a cloud as a covering and a fire to give light at night. Israel asked, and God brought them quail. He satisfied them with the bread of heaven. He opened the rock, and water gushed out, and it flowed like a river in the desert. In their darkest time, God turned their weeping into joy. He turned their poverty into wealth, and he led them out of Egypt toward a promised land. And we all know their story. Didn't end there, Chris. Israel then spent 40 years in the wilderness, trying to learn to trust God and to follow him closely. What you're experiencing now probably feels a lot like wilderness. Debi is in the promised land, but you're stuck here in the desert with the rest of us. And it doesn't seem fair. But amazing things happen in the wilderness. First, God brought Israel through the Red Sea. Second, he led them. He let them see his presence with a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day. And every time they began to think their situation was hopeless, God came through for them. When they needed food, he sent manna from heaven. When they were tired of manna, he sent meat for them. When it looked like they would have nothing to drink and could even die of thirst, God opened up the rock and water gushed out like a river in the desert. Their story is like a telling of our story. We all have good times and we all have bad times. We all go through situations that look hopeless, situations that make us enslaved to grief, and yet God comes through with what we need when we most need it. We must learn to lean on him, to trust him, to let him direct us, and he will fill our emptiness with fullness. He will make the dry desert of hurt and of loneliness filled with water like a river in the desert. And finally, Chris, there's one other story, although I had 4, but I promised to cut my sermon in half. There's the story of a man named Lazarus in the scripture. You remember Lazarus' story, don't you? And he passed away, and John's gospel says this: Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and his sister Martha. This Mary was brother to Lazarus, who now lay sick. She was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. We all experienced this recently. It reminds me of your struggle, Chris. We all joined with you in prayer for Debi when we found out she needed bypass surgery. We prayed for God to be with her and for God to spare her life. And we thought he did. We thought she would fully recover. Just like the family of Lazarus, they sent messages to Jesus. Hey, Jesus, they asked, come and heal your friend. He is sick. But Jesus did not come and heal Lazarus. And Lazarus died, and they wrapped him up, and they put him in a tomb. And when Jesus finally arrived in the village of Bethany to be with the family, Martha ran out to meet him, and she basically asked him the same question you're asking God right now. Why? Where were you? Why did you let this happen? You could have fixed it, Lord. Where were you? Listen to Martha's words, probably tear-filled words. Perhaps she utters them with a real tone of disappointment. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Where were you, God? Why did you let this happen? And Chris, it's okay to ask that question. It's even okay to feel upset with God. But you know the rest of the story. The story of Lazarus doesn't end with loss. It ends with a miracle. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And she said, I know he will rise in the resurrection at the last day. And then Jesus said these words, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Whoever believes in me, even if they die, they will live. Debbie believed in Jesus Christ. She lived for Christ. And in leaving this world, in dying, she now lives forever with Christ. And this is our greatest comfort. But we are left to grieve.